welcome. This is our final segment for the anniversary weekend, and I'm extraordinarily pleased to bring out on the battlefield today Cameron Sowers, who is a third-year student at Gettysburg College, and he works with my dear friend Dr. Peter Carmichael. Cameron this year was at the Civil War Institute, which if you have not done it, it's probably an unparalleled 5-day experience by a top-notch operation, and just an extraordinary number of really good scholars, public historians, immerse you in the Civil War for, I guess, typically 5-day time.
Yeah.
So as we've been trying to do throughout the course of the past 3 days, we're trying to tell broad stories at the micro level. And then so today, I was really intrigued by something that Cameron said at CWI about the letters of Phillip Hamlin, a soldier in the 1st Minnesota. And so I'm going to allow Cameron to talk about Hamlin's experiences here, and you might want to connect that, of course, to the project that was the impetus behind this.
Yeah, so this project on Phillip Hamlin started the fall of my 1st year here at Gettysburg, and I'm continuing my research on it this summer as the CWI Summer Research Fellow. So that was what brought me to the conference. And Phillip Hamlin, he's born in 1839 in Warren County, Pennsylvania. He moves to Minnesota like many of his comrades would in the mid-1850s. Cheap, affordable farmland was drawing people from across the nation into Minnesota. Hamlin enlists early in 1861, feeling duty-bound by strong religious convictions that the war was God's will. He quickly answered President Lincoln's call. His letters home start 2 days before the actual call from enlistments, because the 1st Minnesota is one of the first regiments that get mustered into federal service. And he viewed the war as means necessary for human progress, writing in April of '61 that, quote, "The present magnificent uprising has led the people to make the greatest sacrifices, and as virtues go in cluster, these things will lead the people to a higher and nobler course of conduct in the future."
We might want to pause there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is some stirring rhetoric, and it's very nationalistic, and so here's a man who's relatively young, but feels like he's part of this broader project, and it's one that is guided by God's hand.
Yeah, at age 20, his writing really defies his age and lack of formal education. He's writing in what Dr. Stephen Barry has talked about recently as being the high tongue of Civil War soldiers that we think of in what we think of the languages. That's really how Hamlin writes throughout the war. It's very biblical. A comrade recalls an incident in his memoirs at night in the fall of '62 of Hamlin as the men lay down to sleep. Hamlin quotes Hamlet. I forget the excerpt, but he quotes a couple of lines from Shakespeare's play. And I think just kind of speaks to really the language and rhetoric that's throughout his letters.
And I think this is one of the things the scholars have been doing so well. And again, Cameron mentioned Dr. Barry in particular and his project at UGA, exposing us to different types of voices and men who have different levels of education, and they're conveying, in some instances, a lot of these classical allusions in their letters home, and in other cases we're talking about yeoman farmers who have not been exposed to things like Shakespeare. So there's profound differences in their representations of the war and their understanding of these experiences. So we, as historians and students of the conflict, have to be very careful when reading these letters and kind of understand the world through which they're filtering them.
Yeah, so Hamlin writes 90 letters home. He focuses on 2 main things. Virginia agriculture. As a farmer in Minnesota, Hamlin is very curious to see the system of Virginia, which is naturally different from in Minnesota because of the differences in the composition of the soil. So he's trying to figure out how Virginia agriculture works throughout his campaigns. And then he also writes consistently about religion. At times his letters read like theological tracts. He consistently uses a refrain, "In these hours of peril and trial, how inconceivably precious is the Christian's hope." He also spends a lot of time venting about inadequate chaplains and about comrades who rely on vices of sin, like reading novels and drinking whiskey. The Hamlin only believes in the Bible as being the only really leisure reading that he does. So Hamlin's letters, there's 90 of them throughout the war. The last one he writes is on the long, hot march up from Virginia into Pennsylvania. And at no point during the war did he devote as much time and space to writing about the movements as the Army as he does in his last letter home in June 25th of 1863. And I think it's perhaps he sensed what was coming. His religious rhetoric about impending doom and trusting in God really amplifies during the start of the Pennsylvania campaign. And he writes in the last paragraph of his last letter, it starts, "I know that whatever befalls me, all is well, for I am in safe hands. Oh, it is sweet to trust in the all-seeing one." And Hamlin carries that trust with him when the 1st Minnesota arrives here on the 2nd day. They're initially being held in reserve off over to our right as a bee tries to attack me. But Hamlin, unlike many of his comrades, is not in the famous charge of the Minnesota unit on the second day. He's in Company F, which gets detached down the line not long after the 1st Minnesota gets on the battlefield. And so they're skirmishing off about a quarter mile away from where the 1st Minnesota is still being hit. So they're off, and they end up in between Wilcox and Barksdale's brigades in the field. So they kind of get caught in the middle, and they disappear for most of the rest of the day. But from their position, they can see their comrades. And they see and they hear.
Area right behind us.
Yeah. So down past the Pennsylvania Monument, where the 1st Minnesota Monument is today, the 1st Minnesota Company F with Hamlin is about a quarter mile down past that, and they hear the roar of gunfire emitting from where they had left their comrades. And they had a feeling, and they became distraught. Hamlin's company commander, Captain John Ball, sends Hamlin down the line to go see what's happening. They're so distraught, the entire company wants to go. But Ball knows he can't do that. He can't send his entire company away. He doesn't have the orders to do it. So he just sends Hamlin down the line. And Hamlin finds out the grim truth. He comes back, and when he reports the news, the regiment doesn't believe what happened. They're not really believing Hamlin. They're trying to hold on to that hope. One comrade of Hamlin recalls that there was a general expression of belief that, quote, it could not be quite as bad as this. So they're holding on hope, but when they reunite on the night of July 2nd into July 3rd with the survivors of the charge, of which there's not many, the same man recalled, we had not been separated far or long, but the greetings were as sincere and earnest as if oceans had divided us and years elapsed. There was a flood of inquiries about the missing ones, and the answers left no doubts in our mind of the awful calamity that had befallen the regiment. And on the night of July 2nd into July 3rd, the survivors of the 1st Minnesota come back into this position where we are. The obelisk behind us marks their position that they're going to have on the night of July 3rd, or the night of July 2nd into July 3rd. They're going to fortify this position. They're going to create earthworks and a barrier about 18 inches to 2 feet high to try and stop some of the musket fire that's going to hit them. And they're going to participate in the repulsion of Picketts Charge on July 3rd. Their men, they're going to sweep across this field over to our left, and they're going to end up hitting Kemper's brigade back there. And it's in that charge that the 1st Minnesota makes here on the 3rd day into Confederate lines that Phillip Hamlin was killed. He received 4 bullet wounds, according to a comrade, 1 shattering the left leg, 1 through the thigh, a 3rd through the neck, and a 4th through the heart. He's just one of 2 men from Company F killed that day, but the 1st Minnesota suffers another 32 casualties here on the 3rd day. And Hamlin's death is a heroic sacrifice of life on behalf of his country in the name of his most deeply held religious principles. He believed firmly in the Union cause and that the country would one day become whole. His faith in God allowed him to trust the Union cause was a superior one, ordained by the Almighty, and that this war would serve as a lesson and moral teaching for the nation. On the fields of Gettysburg, Hamlin becomes not only a martyr for the Union, but a martyr for his Christian faith. He brought that faith to his comrades through camp meetings and his own personal religious faith, something they admired and respected him for, even if they didn't necessarily agree. Hamlin believed that his death, if it were to come on the field of battle, was God's plan, and that plan is enacted here on July 3rd, 1863. But on the night of July 3rd, going into July 4th, Hamlin's comrades bury him on the field. They seek out his remains and they bury him near Peter Frey's house, over a couple hundred yards away from us. Hamlin's comrades write, we decided to bury him that night. Search was made for a spade, and after some time a shovel was found. With this, a shallow trench was dug beside a walnut tree, near which he had been killed, struck by 4 bullets. His blanket and tent cloth spread in it, he was laid and covered with the remaining portions. Then those present knelt in silence about him with uncovered, bowed heads. I do not now recall that a word was spoken, but as a sincere and reverential service, fitting the time and situation. The same comrade, James Wright, who would write a memoir that contains many anecdotes about Hamlin, would then fulfill his Victorian obligation and write Hamlin's father, informing him of the death of his oldest son. He wrote of Philip, he was an earnest and consistent Christian, and I doubt not he is in the better land. We often talked on the subject of death, and I know he was prepared. In that same letter, James Wright includes a lock of Hamlin's hair and a piece of the 1st Minnesota battle flag, both of which are still in possession of the Hamlin family today. A descendant from the Hamlin family has reached out to me and shared pictures of those. Phillips.
And I think, if I may, I mean, what's so striking about that phraseology is it kind of echoes with what we were talking about yesterday. Again, we mentioned that John Futch himself was illiterate, but he had people writing letters for him who may have been transitionally literate or may have been speaking in high tongue depending upon the specific letter, and the idea of a soldier's death having to have some sort of higher meaning, and more importantly, they themselves are, as they put it often, in a far better place.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we see. The mourning language in the high tongue continues from Hamlin's younger brother, who's stationed out in the western theater with the 7th Minnesota Infantry, and his brother finds out from letters home that Philip has been killed. And he writes about what the death means for the country and that he's willing to do the same thing for his country. And Jacob Hamlin is killed in 1864 at the Battle of Nashville of a cannonball wound. So the Hamlin family gives their 2 oldest sons for the Union cause, but the reactions of the death of both of their sons brings the same religious language and the understanding of meaning of for God and for country. So the Hamlin letters have been the main thing. Jacob, following the death of Philip, he takes on the role that Philip had as the patriarchal older sibling giving advice. There's 6 Hamlin children, I believe off the top of my head, ages 17 to 5 that are still at home. So Jacob is writing home after Philip's death, trying to help give meaning and understanding to younger children about what his death meant. And I think that's a part of when we study Reconstruction and reunion, that the next generation that comes that maybe doesn't fight in the Civil War might be losing older siblings. Hamlin's youngest brother is 5 years old. He's not old enough to experience the war really firsthand, but he'll know that his 2 older brothers were killed during the war. And so Hamlin survives in comrades and letters and monuments here. The first monument placed on the Gettysburg National Park is in the Soldiers National Cemetery. It's the Minnesota urn, which sits next to Hamilton's grave, and it reminds us that all time is the millennium of their glory. And that's kind of where the Hamlin story ends as of right now.
That's perfect and incredibly powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Cameron, I deeply appreciate it. Again, Cameron is a 3rd-year student here at Gettysburg College. He's doing fantastic work as a student at the Civil War Institute, and we're extraordinarily excited about your project and then how it interfaces with a larger project at Gettysburg. So thank you all very much for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And we wish you all a good afternoon.